Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this professional webinar entitled Effective Approaches to Addressing Aggressive Behaviors. My name is Catherine, and I have the privilege of introducing our incredible presenters today with Adopt for Life, a not-for-profit charitable organization that provides peer support, community, education, advocacy, and awareness to adoption, kinship, permanency, and customary care communities across Ontario and beyond. I am so very honored to have so many of you join us today, both within Canada as well as internationally, as we learn evidence-based strategies and practice-informed approaches to help us build capacities within families, including safety within the home, as well as the healthcare settings. Before I kind of get into how we're going to be using this platform, I do want to take pause and acknowledge the lands that we are situated on today. I understand and acknowledge that we're probably coming from various places within the world. So I do ask that you just take the time to reflect on your own personal territory and treaty. I personally reside in the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and Mississauga of the Credits people within Treaty 19, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations, and as a first step towards improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures, to recognize and acknowledge the historic as well as the ongoing devastating effects of colonialism and racism in the name of assimilation across Canada, and to consider how we each can, in our own way, action forward in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. We would like this to be an engaging and an interactive webinar this afternoon, so please feel free to use the chat feature for any sort of tech-related issues, to share any comments you may have on the content, or just engaging in general. We'd love to know also where you're logging in from, so please feel free to jot down your city in the comments. Please feel free to also use the closed captioning feature if you'd like to enhance your understanding of the audio content or for any accommodations of hearing needs. Now, if you do have any specific questions for the AFCCA supports team, we do ask that you use the Q&A feature in which you'll actually have the option of asking questions anonymously if preferred. Please know, however, that due to the number of participants that we have, we aren't going to be able to answer all questions live. However, we will be following up with a copy of this recording, as well as other relevant materials and the answer to all the questions that we weren't able to get to today. Also, if you are watching this as a recording, please know that you are also more than welcome to ask questions. So you can email us at afcasupport@adoptforlife.com or leave a comment below. At the end of this presentation, you will receive a short survey. We would very much appreciate if you can take a few minutes to fill this out, as it really helps shape the work that we do, and it's going to help support any future topics or resources that are available. This will also be included in the email that you will receive after we are done this presentation and within the next few days. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our presenters for this afternoon. So we're excited to have Ruby join us, who is going to be both a part of the presentation, as well as who's going to be helping monitor and answer questions or address any urgent needs. So Ruby is the Equity Access Clinician on the AFCCA team. She has a master's degree in social work and has experience working with children, youth, and families from various social services, healthcare, and therapeutic settings. Her clinical programs, including development, community engagement, and she also is working to increase the accessibility to the AFCCA support teams for historically underserved communities. Her work aims to ensure that caregivers and families from all different backgrounds and life circumstances can access the support they need. We also have Maude. She is our AFCCA clinical lead and brings extensive clinical research and personal experiences to Adopt for Life. She's a mother of 5 children, both from birth and adoption, and her children were older adoptees when they came together as a family. She is a neuroscience PhD candidate from Queen's University with a specialty in FASD, trauma, AFCCA, and she is also a registered social worker, physiotherapist, psychotherapist, and has her MSW. Maude, I wouldn't be surprised if you're a physiotherapist as well with all of your qualifications. I'll just add that into it.
Why not?
Believe it or not, guys, I'm actually just giving you a little snippet of their qualifications. So if you are interested in understanding more about how amazing the AFCCA team is, please feel free to visit us at www.adoptforlife.com. Last, absolutely not least, is our wonderful Jen. Jen is joining us, one, because she's incredible and she is the AFCCA parent liaison, and she's also filling in for Tanya, who unfortunately is ill today. She is a parent of 6 children and teens and has a background in social work. She and her husband became concurrent foster parents over 10 years after having 2 biological children. They have fostered over a dozen babies, toddlers, and have also adopted 3 older children from the public system. Their youngest child also came to them through kinship care. Through her personal experiences, Jen is deeply acquainted with the challenges faced by families affected by FASD, developmental trauma, attachment disorder, and anxiety. Okay, I appreciate that was a lot of talking on my end. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera. I'm going to stay here to help support any tech-related issues that you may have, and I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we're going to have Maude share her screen here so we can start our slideshow. We are so very excited that so many of you are joining us today from all over Ontario. And as Catherine has already explained, this webinar is all about effective approaches to addressing aggression toward family and caregivers in childhood and adolescence, otherwise known as AFCCA. You're going to hear a lot more about this acronym as we go on in our presentation. And I would just love it if we can even light up the chat if you have heard the term AFCCA before or not, just so that we know kind of your own background and what kind of knowledge you're coming to this presentation with. And Maude's going to introduce a few members of our team that aren't on camera today.
Yes, thank you, Jen. So we also have Nancy Lockwood. Actually, I should say Nancy and Tanya and myself started a program also in Ottawa called Fetal Alcohol Resource Program. You may have heard about it before, so we previously knew each other. Nancy has over 25 years of experience in education. She's the co-director and practice lead of our program. Tanya is a psychotherapist. She was an FASD worker at the same time as me back in Vancouver, early 2000. She's quite the expert in FASD. Unfortunately, she cannot be here today, but wonderful Jen is filling in for her. And we also have Alice, who works with Ruby on our equity, diversity, and inclusion program. They're wonderful at reviewing everything we do, making sure we're inclusive and respectful in how we're providing services to families. So I will let Jen continue with what AFCCA is.
Yes, so I saw rolling through the chat there that there are quite a number of you who have not heard the term before. So we're just going to explain a little bit about it. This is actually an acronym that is fairly new to Canada, and it came about from a national consortium that was held a few years ago and actually is ongoing research. And it basically describes behavior and a certain period of time in life. So when we talk about AFCCA, we're really referring to aggression that is directed from a child or adolescent toward their caregiver or other siblings in the home. And it causes significant harm to the child or adolescent, as well as the person or persons the behavior is directed towards, and those who witness it. In the past, you may have heard the term CPVA, or child to parent violence and aggression. And the reason we're not using that term anymore is because we've heard from families, caregivers, children, and professionals that the word violence in and of itself is highly stigmatizing. So aggression seemed to be a much better descriptor. And aggression also encompasses more than just physical aggression. So we're not just talking about physical aggression, we're talking about verbal aggression, property damage, emotional, psychological aggression. And really it was felt that AFCCA was a better term to describe it. And we know, especially since the pandemic, that it's increasing in severity and also frequency. So that's a little bit about what the word means. And I'm going to talk later about the National Consortium so you can find out more about it. But I'm going to just pass this back to Maude next.
Thank you, Jen. So when we did the consortium, we realized that there was a lot of assumptions about AFCCA, or assumptions in general about what it means when a child is displaying aggressive behaviors, very inappropriate behaviors, dangerous behaviors, what it means about their parents. So I'm just curious, what are your not your own assumptions, but what do you think are society's assumptions about these children and about their families? So I'm interested in hearing from some of you in the chat.
I'm already seeing some popping up in the chat here. Poor parenting.
Poor parenting.
Yeah.
That the family has no control. And even recently, a member of the government, you may have seen it in the news when they were, the school were talking about how many children were sent home because of aggressive behaviors. There was a comment on, he made a comment on, if it happened to me when I was younger, I would have been, my parents would have dealt with it probably with, physical aggression. So it was interesting to hear that, because the idea behind it was like, okay, that means there's not enough discipline in the home. And I think that's a lot of things that we're hearing. So yes, what people are saying in the chat is that, probably it's poor parenting, difficulties with, discipline, but also a lot of people are talking about, okay, maybe the child has no developmental disabilities and mental health issues. And actually, this is what we saw in AFCCA. I think in our society, quite often we're trying to look at the child's behavior, and that's how we will assess the parenting. Unfortunately, when you have a child with severe mental health issues, with trauma, with neurodevelopmental disorders, it can lead to AFCCA, can lead to aggression towards family members, and it's not related in any way to the parenting. I mean, the parenting can help for sure, and early intervention and all that, but there's a lot of assumptions, and there's a lot of shame and blame around AFCCA because of these assumptions. So thank you for everyone who shared their perspective on it.
I'm actually really glad seeing a lot of these comments in the chat about what comes to mind: poor parenting, entitled children, lack of discipline. These are some things I wrote down. And just as an aside, I'm here presenting as a caregiver with living experience with AFCCA, as an adoptive parent as well. And I maybe would have had some of the same answers as what's happening in the chat here 10 years ago. I raised neurotypical children and thought I knew what I was doing as a parent, that I was highly skilled as a parent. And there's a lot more going on that we're going to get into in a moment that leads to AFCCA. And actually, you'd be surprised to know that studies are showing a lot of caregivers are what I would call expert parents that are dealing with AFCCA in their home. So part of the consortium report was that we asked families what AFCCA looks like in their home. So what I wanted to draw your attention to, I'm not going to go over all of these numbers, but basically the big one here is that 76% of those who reported AFCCA reported that they were experiencing it on a daily or weekly incidents, and that it was 55% considered it 8 out of 10 intensity or higher. So this isn't just a child who's, you know, a toddler throwing a temper tantrum, or a teenager who's getting mad at their parent every once in a while, or punching a hole in the wall because they're angry about something that they weren't allowed to do. This is actually intense, prolonged aggression in the home happening very regularly. And as you'll be learning in a moment, this is hidden. This is oftentimes hidden. This is not something caregivers generally come forward and share. Much of the time, it's only happening in the home and not in the community or in the school system, or where others might be viewing it. You can see there, it's most often directed towards parents or caregivers. And self-harm is also a big piece of AFCCA. It's not self-harm in and of itself does not constitute AFCCA, but it is in the mix and often combined with other factors. You can see there siblings, pets, other extended family are often the recipients of the aggression. And property destruction, psychological, emotional injury or harm, aggressive language, swearing, also posturing along with that language. So this just kind of gives a little bit of a better sense of what we mean when we say AFCCA and what it actually looks like in the home. So Maude, if you don't mind flipping to the next slide. I referenced earlier having raised some children that are neurotypical. We also have FASD represented in our home, as well as, I know Catherine already kind of rhymed off a bit of my story. And most often with AFCCA, you can see the biggies on here: FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism, anxiety disorder, ADHD. There are coexisting neurodevelopmental disabilities and related conditions. I will say, in our work with Adopt for Life throughout Ontario, FASD is probably the most high, the highest representation of families that are experiencing severe AFCCA. FASD is playing a factor, and we're going to talk about that more later into the presentation. But I think this is an important slide to share because it speaks to the fact that this isn't really bad parenting. This isn't parents, not knowing what to do or letting their child get away with whatever. A lot of this is because of an existing condition within the child. I see here in the chat, trauma-based as well. A lot of this is trauma from younger years at play. So it's really important to keep that in mind as we're talking, that we focus on some of the things within the child that maybe they came to life born with, that we're dealing with as caregivers. So Maude, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Jen. I also want to answer a question in the chat that I think is important, asking is AFCCA, when there's aggression in the school, is it considered AFCCA? So yes and no. Let's say a child experiences bullying, doesn't have neurodevelopmental disorders, and then will often lash out at other students, maybe display aggression at school. We wouldn't call this AFCCA. It's called aggression. So AFCCA, it's when it's directed towards family members, caregivers, and we would include teachers and caregivers, but it's usually when it's in the family context because of the impact. The impact is felt on the parents because it's difficult for them to attend work. They have so many appointments, medical trial. You're thinking of the physical injury that they may have from, their child, the trauma, emotional injury, maybe not having to be able to keep your child in your home, difficulties with the siblings. It's a 24/7, I don't want to say job because it's not a job, but it's happening every day in your home. So the impact is way different than if it was a teacher. And I mean, it's terrible for teachers as well, but this is an entirely different kind of trauma or situation. But often we also see children who will display AFCCA in the home and in other environments. I mean, every situation is unique. AFCCA is also a wide spectrum of behaviors and impacts. So we decided to also mention a few things about FASD. For those who are less familiar, a great resource is Scan FASD. Very informative website based on the latest research. So you can read the top articles. You have a lot of facts on it. So if you combine autism, cerebral palsy, and Down syndrome together, the FASD impact in Canada is actually much higher. It's between 4 and 6% of the general population in Canada. A lot of them are misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all because of the Canadian guidelines that are sometimes difficult to meet, and the lack of capacity within our healthcare sector to diagnose. Also, more than 90% of individuals with FASD will have mental health issues. Personally, I've never encountered someone who has FASD and no mental health issues. At least they will have ADHD, anxiety. Many of them will have some kind of depression. And so in our program, we also see, I guess most of the families that we see raise children with FASD. They're often the ones that are falling through the crack and that are not responding well to common behavioral therapy like ABA, for example. Like there's only one case study on ABA and FASD, so it's not evidence-based for this population. And there's a lot of things to keep in mind when we're providing services to families who have children and young people with FASD. So one of them is the impulse control. It's often in the way and can lead to aggressive behaviors. And we're often recommending that there's a strong partnership between the caregivers and the young person, especially when they're teenagers and they're allowed confidentiality. We try to work around it because with their difficulties with confabulation and memory issues, judgment, they really need someone else to make sure they're following through with their recommendations. But also what they are reporting is actually factual. So I'll give you an example. Confabulation is actually a memory issue. So it's basically, let's say my brain remembered that I ate spaghetti yesterday, and I'm really sure I ate spaghetti, and I would tell that to Jen, and then the rest of my family would say, well, actually it was tacos. But I'm convinced it's not that I want to lie. So this is often happening with FASD. They don't remember it properly. So it's important to have a family member, caregiver, someone that they trust to build that collaboration. It's also a whole body disorder. There's over 200 comorbidities with FASD, so you're very likely to encounter them in the healthcare system. The facial features only happen in 10% of them. So that's a myth to think, oh, they don't have a facial feature, so probably it's not that bad, or they probably don't have it. Their judgment is quite affected as well, so it's hard for them to make good decisions in their day-to-day life. So even if the parents give them the best advice, provide supervision, it's possible that they will get in trouble and continue to get in trouble. The good news is now we have more intervention that we can do for people with FASD so they can improve. It is still a lifelong disability, but with support, a lot of them can thrive and do well. Very often as they mature, we will see that there's still some issues, but with the right support, we can reduce the harm that can happen. So for example, if they're using drugs, we will make sure that they have enough supervision or access to the right support or clean tools, for example, and same thing for their sexuality. So as we're presenting today, keep in mind that this is sometimes very complex to support these individuals and their family members. And that while we don't want to say that people with FASD all display AFCCA, or people with autism or people with mental health issues, not all of them will display aggression, or, we should never label them violent, but it's actually higher in this population.
And I think, Maude, I'm just noticing in the chat the amount of shock that's coming up, people not realizing that FASD is this prevalent in Canada, 4 to 6%, and that it's not talked about enough. And I just did really want to mention, as a parent where there's FASD represented in my home, This is something that comes up again and again when you're living with AFCCA, when you visit the doctor, somebody in the medical field, schools, that there is such a lack of knowledge and education about FASD. So if you are working in this field, please do your best to educate yourself on it. I can't tell you how hard it is as a caregiver to hear the same kind of people trying to give me advice that don't really understand my child's brain-based disorder. And oh, well, what you just need to teach them again and again and repeat it again and again, and they'll learn eventually, not realizing that that's not how FASD works. And that maybe I would spend 1 hour teaching my neurotypical child this skill, and I might spend 1,000 hours trying to teach the same skill to my other children, and it never gets learned. So I think this is something that's really, there's not enough funding, obviously, there's not enough education around it, both prevention and what we do with our kiddos who are living with it. So yes, please, Maude already mentioned the CanFASD site, but please have a visit and try to learn more.
Thank you, Jen. We also have an FASD 101 on the YouTube.
Yes.
Not AFCCA, sorry, Adopt for Life page that I presented maybe 6 years ago, but it's still quite accurate. Why children use aggression. And so actually some of the things that were mentioned in the chat are actually true. Like some of it are assumptions, but sometimes this is actually what happens. It's never, so I wrote some elements, but it's never one thing. It's like a big puzzle, and there's different elements to it. So when we're looking at a child who's displaying aggression, we're not only going to look at, oh, this is just dysregulation or this or that, right? This is their trauma. Usually it's way more complicated than that. It's many pieces of the puzzle. But it comes down to one thing, the self-regulation issues. Difficulties managing their emotions and behaviors and thinking. But the self-regulation issues themselves stem from many reasons. Their brain is wired differently because maybe they've been pre-exposed to alcohol before they were born, exposed to drugs. Maybe there's a lot of intergenerational trauma there, and it's changing their genes. Maybe there's the trauma, the neglect that happened very early after they were born. If their parents were exposed to domestic violence and they were highly stressed when they were pregnant. And quite often what we're seeing is, let's say a child is born with prenatal exposure, it will actually dysregulate their the way they manage anxiety and stress. So they're actually more vulnerable to stress, to stressful situation. So they're more exposed to trauma, plus they're more vulnerable to trauma. So that's like an added component. So often it will lead to difficulties with attachment. Maybe it's in the history as well, like being in foster care, adopted, and it leads to anxiety and other mental health issues. And then if you have this mix, very likely you'll be more inclined to be affected by these other elements. Perception. So we know from research that a child or a person who's been exposed to trauma as a child, when they look at a still face, they're more inclined to think this is an angry face rather than a serious face. So this can lead to, oh, this person's angry, and then they lash out as well. Or even perceiving why is my parents setting rules and boundaries? A child who's well attached, who doesn't have trauma, will say, oh, my parents love me. That's why they're doing this. I mean, I have teenagers, they don't always think that, but most of them will. But a child who displays AFCCA, very often we ask about their perception. That's what they're thinking. So it's important to go and assess, like, what's the child's perception? Doesn't mean it's true, but it's their reality. The shame that they experience. If you have FASD, autism, and ADHD, and you've been in trouble since you were a child, over and over at school, in the community, with your parents, you develop a lot of shame. And shame can also bring to a lot of dysregulating behaviors and mental health. And And the last three that we don't talk about very often, I would say it's not enough in itself, but they add to like the cocktail of how we can develop AFCA. So aggressive script is basically if you go to school, people say, "Oh, he did this to me, so I just punch him back. Oh, I'm gonna wait for him after school." These kind of aggressive script, teenagers use them. It's on TV, it's on TikTok, social media. But for someone who's very vulnerable and has difficulties in their judgment, this will affect them more and lead to more aggressive behaviors. Same for modeling. The impact of peers might be worse. The impact of seeing it in your family of origin, for example. And the priming effect, that's the last one, is it's snowing today, so I'll use this example. If you go slide, the more you slide on one trail, it's gonna go faster and faster. So that's the same thing with priming. The more you use a behavior, the more you're inclined to use it. So with some of our kids, sometimes that behavior has been reinforced, even if we don't want to, and it leads for them to use it more and more. So for example, kids who make threats, we were talking about self-harm. If they make threats of self-harm and they see if this is actually working, they're gonna be more inclined to use it. So that's another thing that we look at. So what can we do? In some kids, we can look at some of these elements and say, okay, we can work on changing the child's behavior. We can work on improving their emotional difficulties. Can they recover from trauma? Can we change their perception somehow and, work with the parents on attachment? But sometimes it's quite severe, the mental health, the mental disorders, and we cannot change the behavior of the child that much. So what can we do? And this is kind of what we're talking about today. It's not so much about the child, it's about the family. How can we improve outcomes for family members and looking at the quality of life of the whole family and not just the child?
I wanted to share really quickly here. You can see a link on here, and don't worry, you will actually get a copy of this presentation afterwards, so you can find this link. But there's an entire website dedicated to the AFCCA Consortium report, and I really recommend you check it out. There is some pretty mind-blowing information there, but also being able to read stories of families who are living through this and the effect it is having on not just them, but their entire community. It's really important for us to hear them. How many families have been, for example, forced to give up their parental rights in order for their child to get treatment? How many families are, begging and crying for help from our systems, and our systems are just so broken and not communicating enough, and they're not getting the help that they need. So I think in order to really find solutions for the system that you're working within, I think it's important first to read this report and see what the realities are on the ground. Back to you, Maude.
Yes, so I was answering a question in the Q&A. So they're asking for the link to the presentation for FASD 101. So it's in the chat. And someone also mentioned the one from Health Nexus, which I also participated in, and it's really good. So you can go on Health Nexus FASD and you'll find the FASD 101, or not sure how it's called. So when we're looking at the family who's experiencing AFCCA, the way we're assessing it, we're using the balance. And a lot of our families actually have tons of resources that are quite capable. Unfortunately, sometimes they end up, at, I don't know, the hospital with their child, and they're like, oh, you should do triple P or this and that, other parenting classes, but they've done them all. Like they could actually teach the class. And many parents also adopt older at an older age, and sometimes it's difficult, but it's also protective. Like they've been through stuff. Many of our families, they've raised other kids before. They have family members who are supportive, but they have a child who has extreme behaviors that is extremely difficult, and we are in a system that has a lot of stressor. There's a lot of blame, shame. The system doesn't necessarily understand There's not enough respite, not enough psychiatrists at the moment. I'm sure you all know that. And just the daily stressors of being called from school all the time, worrying about your own safety. Many families, when it's a couple, they have one of them stops working because it's not sustainable with all the appointments and the demand. And that's when you hit a crisis, right? Like when even if they're very capable, lots of resources, the demands gets higher and higher and higher, and then things get really off balance. So I'll give you an example of a case, and I will show you how, the kind of systemic support they had, systemic constraint, also capabilities and demand, and you'll see how we're kind of assessing it. Oh, and I should mention that in this model, we don't have it here, but it's at the center, we usually have meaning making. So what's the meaning we put behind our situation? A lot of parents go, I don't think I'm competent enough to do this, because that's the message they keep receiving. I don't feel like I live according to my own values anymore. Like I feel like I value safety, but my home is so unsafe. I value calm and peace, and there's a lot of screaming. And just like I don't feel like I have a life anymore. All these things. And so the meaning making, we can, even without changing the child's behavior, maybe modify some of that narrative with the parents so they can feel safer, even when the situation doesn't change that much. And I think maybe it doesn't make that much sense now, but we will explain later. Okay, case studies. And I'm sure you've seen many of these youth since COVID. And so this is not a specific case, but this is very typical of what we're seeing. So this is a boy, he's 16. During COVID, he was younger, and a lot of trauma in his life before he was adopted, physical spectrum disorder, diagnosed with learning issues, ADHD. He's on meds, very anxious socially, so he doesn't have friends anymore. He's refusing to eat regular food, meals with families. He says it's too much, in his sensory system. On his sensory system, and no longer attends school, plays video games all day long. So very common. Very common what we're seeing. But I think it happened more during COVID, right? It happened gradually in the family. And what happened is the parents were highly competent. They raised other kids before. But then during COVID, it's like, okay, we need to work, so more screen time. And then we're starting to say yes. And it became more and more aggressive. And to the point where it's dangerous for the siblings and the parents. So the parents had to start saying yes or giving in to the child's demand. And it happened gradually. And one day you wake up and like they're only eating hot dogs and playing video games and not showering more than once a month. So this is a typical case of what we would see. We're seeing tons of different cases, but that's a typical one. And the child becomes very demanding, would scream at the parents, you bring me this, you bring me that, and make threats, you fix my backpack. So this is really hard for the parents, because what are the other options? If they start saying no, it's very possible that there will be an increase in aggression. So if we look at this family, they have lots of support around them. They're usually not isolated. They have parenting experiences. They have people around them who want to help, but they don't know how. They've been through a lot of parenting classes. Maybe even one of them works in the system. That's also very common. And very competent parent, generally speaking. But the demands are really high. Like there's a lot of aggression from their child, like hitting, having to call the police. They're traumatized. The siblings are traumatized. Neurodivergence, I named the diagnosis. So no longer attending school. When it was difficult. They're feeling shame. There's a lot of people they don't want to talk to. They don't want to invite people over because of their child's behavior. They're exhausted of having to deal with their son, dealing with the system. Many of them develop health problems that are related to their anxiety. Poor fit of services. When they're trying to get services, oftentimes they get blamed in their parenting. You should do this, you should do that. System navigation, they're calling everywhere, but there's always a waiting list. And they get offered services they don't really need, and then they get blamed because they're refusing services. That's another common one. And that leads to financial strain. And a lot of caregivers that we're seeing are actually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorders and other mental health issues that were not there before, but that they develop because of how difficult their situation is. And they often have to deal with the judgment of friends and families. Do you want to add something, Jen, to this?
I was just going to add to the idea of this scale. Oftentimes what we're finding now, we primarily work with adoptive, kin, and customary caregivers. That's what we're funded for, but many of you are working with a broad section of the population. But especially when you have a child with very challenging behaviors, neurodivergence, the demands are like way down here. I can't even, the camera can't show how low the demand side of the scale would be. And a lot of times the help you're getting or the systemic supports is like hardly anything. And so it's just so unbalanced. And in reality, caregivers who have that much stress and strain need more help than any other caregiver, but they're usually getting less than a caregiver who is raising neurotypical children, and they've got grandparents and the neighbor and so who's helping them lots. And their scale is actually pretty balanced. So I think this is something that's coming up again and again, that the caregivers that are in the most need and need the most help are getting the least. And so what we're finding with AFCCA is that in order to support these families, even in order for AFCCA to decrease, we have to rebalance the scale so that it's the same on either side. Yeah, and I just love this picture of the scale because it really is coming from experience how a lot of us feel.
And what we try to do is also to help families, okay, how can we make the services fit for you? And working with the system and providing these kind of webinars or writing letters. We do circle of support where we meet with families and friends and we explain what AFCCA is, having a common message about the child that's positive and supportive. Can we, the financial strain, does it mean, can we make sure you have the funding you need? How can we help you take care of your healthcare problems? So you have the space to do it, reducing the shame. And what the system will do sometimes it's a parenting class instead of, looking at on the other side, how can we rebalance? So that's kind of how we do it. There was more things, microaggression and racism, which Ruby will talk about later. Anticipated judgment, social isolation. I thought I was done with the problems. Shane, that's your turn. I'll use the bathroom while you do this one.
So a little bit about shame. Our dear colleague Tanya, who couldn't join us here today, likes to say aggression thrives in secrecy. So this isn't just true. I mean, we know this is true for certain domestic violence situations between partners, but it's equally as true when it's children or adolescents directing aggression towards their caregivers or siblings. And the nature of what's happening in the home actually just grows the isolation. So there's a difference here between, I'd like to just note there's a difference between shame and guilt. So guilt says, I've done something wrong. Maybe as a caregiver, you yelled at your kid over something they didn't do wrong. Maybe a teacher called and you overreacted on the phone to them about some situation. You feel a bit guilty afterwards, and guilt drives you to restore and repair what's happened. Shame is different. Shame is just kind of this internal feeling that I am bad, not something I did was bad, but me, myself, and that I'm worthless. Like it's just this feeling. And shame is something that both caregivers and children in an AFCCA situation will feel. And shame often leads to, you can see here, denial, deflection, and escalation, but it also leads you to hide. So instead of reaching out for help, which is what you actually need, you try to hide what's happening in your home. You try to hide how you're feeling about it, which just snowballs into this much bigger beast than it needs to be. So an antidote to shame for the caregiver is to get social support, validation, and compassion. And it's really about getting support from others who understand. And I can't stress that enough. So for myself as a caregiver and many caregivers that I work with, because that's primarily my job, is coming alongside them as caregivers, understanding that doesn't help is when you reach out to a professional and they listen to what you have to say, and then they say, oh yeah, boys will be boys, eh? Or, oh, teenagers. Oh, I had a teenager like that. My teenager was really rebellious too. And it kind of completely invalidates what the caregiver is saying because it's not taking them seriously. I know it's our attempt to try to relate to them, but when our experiences actually are so vastly different, then it causes the caregiver to feel completely unheard when they're not taken seriously, and then they don't reach out for support. So they need social support from others who have kind of walked this road, who know what they're going through and can really kind of completely understand them and not judge. Judgment from others around us causes so much shame. And I think, going back to what we had in the chat at the beginning of our presentation here, a lot of parents, when we say this is poor parenting, lack of discipline, entitled children, when they reach out for help and that's what they hear again and again and again, just think about the mental and emotional toll that takes. And so what can we do to reduce shame as supporters around them is to offer understanding and compassion and not to say those types of statements to them. And to be honest, as I already referenced as a caregiver, if I hadn't had this different parenting experience of parenting neurotypical children, that things turned out fairly well, and I thought I knew what I was doing, I would have believed this kind of lie that you're a terrible parent. Your children are doing this because of mistakes you have made. But I know, no, it can't be that because I'm parenting very similarly, both of sets of my children. But there are many parents who are only raising a child who is not neurotypical. So that's their only experience. And so they're doubting themselves. And so one thing we can really offer is our support for them when they come forward. The very first thing you say could be, I believe you. I believe this is what you're going through and this is really hard. And how can I help? So these are just some things that we can start to think about so that this whole piece of AFCCA can kind of come out into the light and stop being hidden so much. When we introduce other people that are there, witnessing, collaborating, this is how we deal with the shame. And when we kind of combat the lies that caregivers are receiving with the truth, this is what's most helpful. I think we've got another slide after this, Maude, that I just wanted to dig into a little bit with regards to polyvagal theory. Now, if Tanya were here, she would do this much better than myself. But if, again, in the chat, if you've heard of the polyvagal theory or polyvagal therapy, pop it in the chat, yes or no, just so we kind of know what you've heard. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of kind of equally yes and no, maybe a few more no's than yeses. Polyvagal theory is something we've begun to use with a lot of our groups of caregivers. And basically the idea behind it is that if a caregiver can get to the place that they are feeling well within their nervous system, their children are going to do much better. And parents are so used to reaching out and all of the help is for the child. Let's do this for the child. Let's do this for the child. And caregivers are actually completely burnt out and not doing well at all and not getting the help that they need. So here we have the polyvagal ladder, it's called. And the idea of polyvagal is based on the autonomic nervous system as a ladder. And you can see there's kind of three components. So at the top, we have ventral vagal. And this is where a caregiver or any person actually is feeling safe, social, and engaged. Kind of, you could think this is kind of my happy energized place. This is where I can kind of dream about the future, have joy. And then in the middle, we have our sympathetic system. Think for this one, fight or flight, deer in the headlights. Your heart is racing, you're feeling very stressed. This is kind of a necessary part of our system. I mean, it's been necessary throughout history for us to have a fight or flight, activation. But what we're finding is caregivers who experience AFCCA regularly get stuck here because they're so used to walking on eggshells to prevent an outburst. They're so used to trying to protect themselves or everybody in their home that they are in a constant state of fight or flight. And then at the bottom, we have the dorsal vagal system. And this is what I would call burnt out. So many of you might see caregivers who are parenting children with a lot of challenging behaviors who are in this state when you see them. They just seem completely exhausted. They can't even think straight to get out a sentence. They can't answer an email. They're just completely at the end of any energy they might have. Now, normally within someone's body, you go up and down this ladder regularly. Like it's completely normal to feel burnt out sometimes and to feel that fight or flight sometimes. But our AFCCA caregivers are stuck either in the middle or the bottom, and they almost never are at the top. And same with their kids. They almost never feel safe. So just picture how that feels. I know before I had children, I was an educational assistant and I worked with a lot of kids with autism. And the days were tough. It was tough. I'm not going to lie. But I could go home at the end of the day and relax and feel good, and feel safe and feel happy. But when you are parenting a child with a lot of aggressive behaviors, you actually never get that escape and you don't get to feel that. And it's just completely different than working in the field when you're living it and this is your home. And when you're afraid to be in your own home. So part of our work with Polyvagal is to help caregivers figure out their own nervous system, if they're experiencing caregiver PTSD or anything like that, to learn to heal from that, to learn to get out of fight or flight or dorsal if that's where they're stuck, and to find joy again. And a big piece of this, to be honest, is a lot of caregivers rediscovering their worth as a human being, that they matter too, not just their kids, that they're a human being that matters, and it matters if they're okay. And they're not being told that nearly enough. And also healthy boundaries. I mean, a big piece of our polyvagal groups that comes out of them when parents are done is they have some healthy boundaries around what can I do, what can't I do, what keeps me safe, what can I offload to somebody else so that I can be okay. So that's just kind of like a very quick crash course in polyvagal theory. There's a lot of tips and strategies we use with caregivers to try to get them to figure out how to calm their nervous system. And in turn, it actually has a really positive effect on their kids' ability to regulate their own nervous system. Just a little bit about polyvagal, and then Maude's going to be sharing about something else we've been using with caregivers with a lot of success.
Mm-hmm. So when we started looking at how can we support families who experience AFCCA, because aggression in the family is not new, but the term AFCCA is actually new. And just as a society, or even in our adoption and foster care community, thinking, okay, we really need to address this. Someone told me about NVR, nonviolent resistance, as a family therapy. And I spoke to a few people in the UK who, as parents, were raising children who had been adopted, and they strongly recommended NVR. So I started looking into this and did a pilot study as part of my doctoral studies, which had a really good outcome. So we decided to integrate it to our Adopt for Life program. So if you want to know more about NVR, there's a website called from Heim Omer. We actually created the NVR program, but as its core, nonviolent resistance is a socio-political approach. It was used by Martin Luther King, used by Gandhi, and it's basically how do you respond to oppression without using violence. And it's not turning the other cheek or letting them, treat you badly. It's about how will you resist. And maybe it sounds weird in the family context, but we'll explain more what it looks like. And so on the picture on the right side, you have Rosa Parks. Maybe some of you heard the story, and I like talking about the story because this is a really good kind of example of a resistance. So Rosa Parks was on a bus way back in the States, and back then there was a law that Black people had to give up their seat to white people. So this white man came up to her and said, "You have to give up your seat." She refused. So that was a resistance. And then she was arrested, but then she wanted to resist, and she rallied with supporters, and they started resisting the oppression they were experiencing by white people at that moment in time. So, and there was a lot of movement also in the States that started based on nonviolent resistance. So what does it mean in the family context? We're not saying that children and young people who display AFCCA are the oppressor, not at all. That's the main difference, I would say, between these two approaches. But there's a lot of things that are similar. And the first thing that we want to do with families is rallying supporters. We want the parents to be able to be a strong anchor for the child in their attachment and their relationship. And because it's so difficult, they cannot do it alone. They need other people to help them. So we have a whole protocol that Jen's going to talk about in rallying those supporters and making sure that the parents feel supported, or the caregivers. We also teach some de-escalation techniques, recognizing some de-escalation patterns that we will talk about. We have the basket exercise. In the caregiver series, you can look at the basket video that Jen made, and this is talking about how would you prioritize your concerns. Same for Rosa Parks, there was probably so many concerns she wanted to address, but let's start with the bus. Let's start with one thing and resist that one. In the family context, if you think about the case study, it wasn't like school, the food and the demand and the video games, and all at once we decided, okay, let's target the aggression and target one of his demands, which was demanding food anytime by screaming. That's an example. And also we're trying to not be child focused, like just focusing, okay, let's do this therapy with the child, let's focus on the meds, focus on this and that. Yes, we don't do that ourselves, but we will encourage families to do that. But we're very concerned about the whole family, the quality of life of the parents, of the siblings, and of the child who displays AFCCA. And sometimes there's more than one child who displays AFCCA. Making sure the parents have restorative time. And it doesn't mean just for the system to provide respite, but what's in the way. If they feel constantly blamed by the system, they're going to feel guilty about taking time for themselves to restore. Finding enough energy to even initiate that. So that's another piece. Relational gestures are, this is another part that we encourage. We won't talk about it too much, but it's basically a one-side, it's not that something that's mutual. It's like the parents would start doing things for the child that they like. For example, I made your favorite spaghetti Thursday. And even if there was an incident the day before. Addressing the shame and the trauma, that's also part of what we do. Parental presence is, at first when I learned about NVR, I thought they meant, oops, I have to go back. I thought they meant like for the parents to be there physically, which yes, we want that, but in our adoptive population, the families that we're seeing, parents are really there. Like there's often a parent who stays home because of the family situation, but it's hard to be emotionally and mentally present for many of them. They had to shut down because they're very traumatized about some of the situation that happened. So with NVR, with Polyvagal, we also address that. And the safety planning, we do safety plans and work on the de-escalation techniques, and Jen's going to talk more about this. So and we won't give you an NVR class today, but this is just to give you an oversight of what it looks like. In our program, I should mention, we have the hybrid model. So we work with the family one-to-one for about 6 or 7 sessions. And in between, we have group sessions through which we teach about the NVR approach, and people are encouraged to share about their situation, about what it looks like to them, and the challenges of applying some of these things. And then once they've completed the program, they're invited to a once-a-month drop-in, and then they can encourage each other to grow in their NVR journey. NVR is very much, it's a journey, it's a way of thinking, a way of being, and it takes a long time to kind of integrate this way of parenting. And I think in a way, it's a way of being. Giving in escalation and joint escalation. So we all have those patterns in a way. The problem is when it gets really entrenched and polarized sometimes between parents. Typical situation, I don't want to be stereotypical towards men and women, but this is often what's happening. The child demands and wants to hit the mom or the sibling, and then the mom, for example, would give in and say, fine, we'll just say yes, because, you know, this is a trigger for him and we'll accommodate. And then the dad sees this and is like, can't treat my wife like this, and then join in de-escalation and start screaming. That's the giving in escalation. So stereotypically, this is what we see, but there's all types of families. Sometimes it looks differently. But when we teach that, I think parents start saying, okay, when do I join in? When do I give in? When do I need to stop giving in? And how can we encourage each other as a couple to be less inclined towards the patterns that are not helping the child and helping the family? And sometimes if there's no partner, we can also ask a supporter to help the parents. So, and it's just, we kind of normalize it. We talk about it in a group. Everyone has different patterns based on their personalities or whatever is a trigger for us. And a big part of NVR is the community, which Jen will talk about.
Yes, Maude already referenced, we're not going to have time. We had a little video clip in here. We're not going to have time to watch it today. But even though we're offering kind of one-on-one supports to adoptive families, we do have an entire YouTube playlist all about different NVR strategies and polyvagal strategies for caregivers that we will send as a follow-up here, and you are welcome to share around with anybody in your circle if you think it would help them on way too many topics for us to have time to cover here. But one of them in particular is all about getting a community of support. And I think one of the things, and I think a lot of you guys would agree as you're listening, that might be going through your mind is one of the reasons it comes up that, oh, it's just parents these days or poor parenting is because, yeah, we're seeing a lot more aggression from children now than we were 50 years ago. I mean, that's fact. And what's not often talked about is why that's changed. And it's not necessarily that parenting has changed that much. Sometimes it is. But what also has changed is that we have lost our villages. So throughout COVID, especially, it really compounded that. But for many of us, we were raised in families and communities where there was a village of support, where it wasn't necessarily just the nuclear family. And for children who really have a lot of challenging behaviors, I got to tell you, the nuclear family does not work. And that's what we've kind of held up as our standard of, you know, independence, a North American standard of this is what a, you know, successful family looks like. And I mean, it's kind of an experiment in failure because it hasn't worked out very well for many people. And one of the things you can do, you yourself as a professional, is help caregivers who are experiencing this find their community again. So this can be formal. It can be in the form of, you know, formal respites and help from the medical community, from their school system, but it can also be really helping them be creative about who are their neighbors, who are their family members who can step in and help. And we have here under community supports a buffer against adversity. And it's really so true. There's a lot, when we say aggression thrives in secrecy, as soon as you introduce another caregiver or another concerned adult into a situation, if a teenager is going off on their caregiver and suddenly the neighbor walks in the door that they, you know, kind of just have a passing relationship with, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that teenagers are going to continue to scream at their parent or punch the walls? Probably not. They're probably going to be embarrassed and stop. If in the middle of a tantrum, a 7-year-old suddenly hears grandma on speakerphone on their parent's cell talking to them, what do you think is going to happen? They're probably going to stop. And so a lot of what we do is trying to encourage caregivers to figure out who their community is so that we can combat some of these things on the left: the aggression, shame, exhaustion, and powerlessness. And I don't know if you don't mind flipping forward, Maude, I think 2 slides. We just have an example of a little bubble exercise we do with caregivers to help them brainstorm. And it's not just community supports. Thank you, Catherine's noting our It Takes a Village video in the chat. That's a good one to watch by someone in our community who was raised in Uganda and sees the differences between Canada and Africa. But it's about brainstorming who can support this parent and caregiver and who can help support this child, and maybe both of them together, so that we can just get this whole relationship working much, much more easily. And also, one of the primary things is parents and caregivers need a break. And they need to stop, as Maude referenced, they need to stop feeling guilty for taking a break, for getting the time they need, for restoring and getting away. So a big piece of it is helping caregivers deal with those feelings of guilt and shame, and helping them rise above that and reach out to the community around them. And then if Maude, if you don't mind flipping to the next one, I know we're getting on in time, but I did want to share, these are some resources we've created for caregivers. Sometimes it's nice for them to have something tangible. So you can see here we have tip sheets on relational gestures and rallying supporters. And we also have fillable tip sheets that they're able to write down ideas themselves. And it's really what we're finding is actually an outcome from nonviolent resistance and this program is that caregivers, maybe their child's behavior didn't change that much, but their own feelings as a caregiver, they're increasingly feeling more confident. They're feeling better about their own choices as a caregiver when they're able to do wonderful things for their child in the form of relational gestures, not expecting anything in return. They feel like a better parent, and that their own sense of well-being, sometimes the aggression just reduces because the child notices mom and dad are more confident, and they're not going to maybe let me walk all over them like they were before. So yeah, we're just finding a lot of these are helpful. And was there one after this, Maude, or are you next for sharing? Just going to see what's going on. Okay, back to you, Maude.
We'll have to skip through maybe de-escalation. Okay, this one's important, especially for people who are experts or work with people with FASD and autism, even anxiety. So one thing that we start noticing when there's a pattern of AFCCA is, especially if there's also FASD and autism, sometimes there's an over-accommodation. So I'll give you an example, is that let's say your child is really triggered by, I don't know, having people over. And for some families, it means they just stop having people over completely. So what we would say is we do need to not make the child's world so small. Like sometimes some of these kids, you're thinking of the kid who doesn't go to school anymore, has no friends, plays video games, and only eats hot dog. I mean, that's just not what it looks like now. But his world was really small. So we have to go, okay, you're anxious about going to school, but how can we make accommodations so you can actually go back to school? How can we make accommodations so you're eating something else than hot dogs? And so there's ways for us to do that. But I think we're encouraging parents to have a good balance and helping them asking themselves those questions, because it's true, it's a fine balance. When there's aggression, like severe aggression in the home, mental health, we do need to provide accommodations. But asking yourselves as clinicians and as caregivers those questions, okay, am I helping this child gradually cope more? Or do I help them avoid all the triggers? And in our work, sometimes we're very focused on triggers, but with parents who are hypervigilant and have the escalation pattern of giving in, it can be sometimes a deterrent to to the child's well-being and the family long term? So these are some questions to ask ourselves. I won't cover all the de-escalation techniques. We were trained in neuro de-escalation. It's something that is, there's a training in Austria. It's a bit different than CPI, but usually what we do with families, we create a safety plan. We have a YouTube page on it. We have a tip sheet, a YouTube video, not a page. And one thing that I would say that might be different than what you're seeing usually is before they're calling the police, unless it's like you really need to call the police now, like 911, sometimes we say call on your supporters, having the supporters as part of the safety plan. And also a lot of parents, it seems like in the community, they're getting the message of you have to be calm. But what we're saying is match the intensity, not the emotion. Like if Jen called me, she said, you know what, my daughter had a major accident, skiing accident, she broke her leg, and I would just go, calm down. Like, this is actually aggravating. You want to say, oh my goodness, I'm so worried for you. What's happening? You kind of want to show in your effect that you understand, you validate their perspective. And if we go back to the perception that I was talking at the beginning, they want to be validated in their perception. Okay, we will skip that. Do you want to talk briefly about the safety plan?
I'll briefly talk. I'd love to know in the chat if any of you watching here today are trained in doing safety plans with caregivers. I know some of you likely are, or if you're not, you could just put no in the chat. But this is one thing that's come up again and again with AFCCA caregivers we're working with, is that the safety plans they have are not adequate. So they may have a safety plan that just says when your child becomes, very physically aggressive, go lock yourself in a room with everybody else in the home. And that's the safety plan. And what they're saying is, I'd really like someone to take more time with me on my safety plan, that it would be unique to my family and that would work for our family. So if you are trained to do safety planning, I would just encourage you to give that some thought. We've got some things written down here. We've actually made specific resources for caregivers about safety planning. We've done a video because a lot of the resources out there are safety plans for domestic violence partnership situation, not for AFCCA. So we need to start thinking about this a little better. I see you have an example of this. Yes, we kind of have a fillable for caregivers. I think, is it on the next page here, Maude, where we've started a tip sheet. I think we included it on here. But basically, the idea is, first of all, there's a lot of caregivers who no one has ever given them permission and told them it's okay to call the police. It's okay to call emergency services if this is what you're experiencing. So that's something you can do when you're on the front lines and you're talking to a caregiver who's disclosing this is what they're going through. I like to tell caregivers, just like every house has a plan for if there's a fire, what are we going to do? If you have a lot of aggression in your home, it's okay to have a plan, write it out, and post it on the fridge. If this happens, if this child does this, this is who we're going to call for help. This is what we're going to do. Just so that in the moment, they don't even have to think about it. They've already game planned what's going to happen in this situation. Now, if I'm being completely frank with you, we have a lot of caregivers we're working with that the aggression is extremely severe. And you may be seeing it in your hospitals, different places you work, where it's life-threatening. So it's really important that they be given a plan because it honestly saves lives. And it can't be so complex that the parents forget what it is. And a big piece of a safety plan is having them brainstorm supporters when they need help. I think on the next slide there, Maude, we have a sample of, I think, a safety plan tip sheet that we have started. So we have a tip sheet and then a fillable we've designed for caregivers that they can fill out with, that have a lot of ideas. Because again, if caregivers are so burnt out, they're stuck in dorsal on polyvagal ladder, they can't think of these ideas. So it's our job as helpers to give them some ideas. Yes, Marie, we're going to have some time for questions here at the end. So if I can just move on to the next thing quickly as we close up. Ruby and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what caregivers need. So we've talked already about validating that they be believed when they come to you. There needs to be a recognition from those of us around caregivers, from professionals, that caregivers are the expert on their own child. And if you read the AFCCA consortium report, that comes up again and again. The caregivers are being treated like they don't know anything about their own child, and we know better as professionals. And actually, if we take the time to really listen, caregivers know what their child needs, and they just need somebody to help them figure out how to get there. They're often highly skilled. It's kind of a myth that they're not highly skilled caregivers. Acknowledge how they're feeling, that shame piece, the fear piece, like they've failed. Helping them find the support, collaboration, and the destigmatization is a big piece. So we were talking earlier about FASD, that not much is known about it. And I think there are certain things that have become the destigmatization of mental health in recent years, of autism spectrum disorder in recent years. And this is something that we're hopeful with AFCCA. The more it's talked about, the more we share and educate and learn, that there isn't going to be the same amount of judgment that we currently experience. And we're just hoping next that Ruby could share a little bit from her perspective as well, as we're dealing with communities that are maybe traditionally underserved. So Ruby, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a moment to talk about multi-layered stigma. So as Jen just mentioned, caregivers who are experiencing AFCCA are faced with immense feelings of shame and stigma. And when we're working with caregivers, we have to recognize that for some families, other aspects of their identity, their life circumstances, and their position within society are going to kind of layer on top of one another to influence the stigma that they feel. So they're going to feel stigma related to AFCCA, but also maybe stigma related to a racialized identity. Maybe the caregiver is disabled themselves. Maybe they belong to another historically underserved community. So really what we want to get across is that many caregivers live with multiple compounding stigmas, and this really influences the well-being of those families, and it influences whether they seek help or not. And I think one of the best ways to illustrate this is by just going over a brief example. So let's say there's a Black single mother. She has a 9-year-old child who's displaying AFCCA in the home. She's currently unemployed, but she used to be a teacher and knows a lot about working with children, but nothing's working with her son. And she's at her wit's end. She really needs support, but she's nervous that if she reaches out for help, that there's going to be certain assumptions that are made about her based on the fact that she's a single Black mom. And maybe there's going to be assumptions that are made about her parenting style, and she's going to be blamed for her child's behavior. So kind of seeing in that context, we can see the different layers of stigma being that she's experiencing AFCCA in the home, she's Black, she's a single mom, maybe she's living in poverty. These things compound together to influence how these caregivers, how these families experience AFCCA. And what this can lead to is heightened isolation, as Jen spoke about, secrecy, high amounts of shame, and not seeking help when it's really needed. And just briefly, I'll talk about a few things we can do to help mitigate that multi-layered stigma. So something we're going to talk about in the moment is the use of safer language. So safer language around AFCCA, but also safer language related to the identities and the life circumstances of the caregiver and the families that you're working with. And then also recognizing the power of our response as professionals to either further stigmatize someone into secrecy or opening up an opportunity to validate and support families and caregivers. And then another important piece that is really key to Adopt for Life's approach is connecting caregivers with community and those with shared experiences, and just letting caregivers know that you're aware that other families are going through this too. They're not the only ones. I know that many caregivers think they're the only ones. So just as a professional saying, you know what, I've actually seen this before and it's quite common. So just allowing caregivers to know that they're not alone. And then also a big part of many of your work might be advocating. So keeping multi-layered stigma in mind when advocating. So thinking about, how is this family perceived based on their life circumstances, and how can I keep that in mind when I'm advocating for their needs?
And Maude, you're muted there.
Yes, sorry. We have a group for dads. That's a drop-in. If you have an adoptive dad you want to refer. I'm not going to go over program evaluation, but you'll have the PowerPoint. And just maybe this one's so important. Ruby mentioned that we promote safer language. I like the safer language rather than safe. If you were looking for adoption-specific language, there's a link here. There's one for FASD as well, provided by CanFASD. And just generally speaking, to reduce the stigma and the shame, we would use the term AFCCA instead of violence. We will never say a child who's violent or violent child, aggressive child. We would say a child who displays aggression, a child who displays AFCCA, and trying to add context to the situation. And also for children's aid, sometimes they would say, well, you know, so do you relinquish your parental rights? Is it child abandonment? And this is extremely hard for families to hear. What we would recommend is that, yes, sometimes it's a little box that they need to tick, but we would recommend is that you talk with the parents about, you know, is it possible that your child needs to live somewhere else, and have that kind of language instead of child abandonment, because that's the last thing that they want. Usually they're quite committed to the point where even some of our families have their life put in danger. So we really need to be supported in that process. So we have like 1 minute, 2 minutes for I think questions. We answered quite a few in the Q&A, but Catherine, I wonder if can direct us if we can add more questions or not.
Yes, we have 2 minutes. So if anyone does have questions, they can probably answer just a few. If not, we'll make sure to answer them in the email that's going to be coming to all of you as well.
While Catherine's looking for the questions there, I just did want to mention, this has kind of been a bit of a crash course this afternoon, but if you'd like more extensive training in AFCCA, please do reach out to us. You can see the email there, afcasupport@adoptforlife.com. You know, we've started to offer trainings for hospitals and just places where there's maybe a large amount of employees that could receive a little more extensive training. So please do reach out.
Absolutely. So I'm just keeping an eye on thing. So there's a couple that came in. I don't think we're going to be able to answer them fully live, but I do want to, you know, there's a lot of questions about strategies coming in. I did post in the comments a lot of resources, so please know that all of those links will be sent to you as well, as far as supports for families. So I do see the questions here, but we should probably wrap up just because I want to be respectful of everybody's time and obviously our incredible presenters. So thank you all so very much for coming and for attending. If you do have questions afterwards as well, you can always email afcasupport@adoptforlife.com or find a way to get to us, because we always want to make sure that we are providing you with the best support as possible. So thank you all again, once again, for coming. Please keep your eye on the coming weeks for a copy of the recording, slides, as well as some resources that you'll be able to use for the families that you support. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.